hopefully they move on quickly. But
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Journeys to Belonging. On this episode, my guest, as soon as I watched my guest's TED Talk, I knew I had to invite her on my podcast. That was several months ago, and now we finally, yay, have a chance to chat about her journey to belonging and how she's using that experience to shape how others view diversity, equity, and inclusion in the world of engineering. I'm so excited for her to share her professional belonging story. Welcome to the podcast, Meagan Pollock.
Thanks, Eileen. I'm excited to be here with you, and I'm thrilled that you loved my TED Talk.
Yeah, and I forgot to ask before we started. I always ask how to pronounce people's names. So did I get it right, or did I miss it?
Meagan Pollock, yes, and my pronouns are she or they.
Perfect. Okay, good. Yes, and thanks for adding your pronouns. I don't usually ask that, but I'm glad that you mentioned it. So I didn't really say too much. I gave people a little bit of a hint about why I asked you on the podcast, but I'd love for you to share about you. What are you up to, and all about the things that you're involved in.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so first of all, I live in Dallas, Texas, and although pre-pandemic, I really just had my stuff here. I used to travel weekly, speaking and teaching across mostly the US and around the globe, but been home for 2 years, although travel is picking back up. So I'm excited about that. But I am born and raised in Texas. And, my experience growing up in the South has certainly shaped my worldview and given me lots of opportunities to reach other people in their journeys to not only belonging, but journeying to helping other people find belonging in the environments in which they live, serve, and work. So a little bit about my background. I'm an engineer by training. My degrees are in computer science, master's electrical engineering. I work for Texas Instruments as an engineer, and I worked on a technology where we use little tiny mirrors, like 1 atom thick of aluminum mirrors, to create projected images. So you could see that technology at the movie theaters. You would see it in like your car's head-up display. So when it projects something there, if you've got a projector in your conference room, there's a good chance that might be a DLP projector. And then I shifted gears from widgets to workshops back in 2009 to study and work on my doctorate. I was really focused on, and remain focused on, how do we increase the participation and the feelings of belongingness for women and people of color within engineering and other technology firms. After my experience working as an engineer, I really wanted to change the culture. I wanted to help create a culture where people who have been traditionally marginalized and excluded not only want to participate and choose engineering, but also feel valued and affirmed in those spaces. And so for the past 12 years or so, I guess going on 13 years, I gotta increase my numbers here. Past 13 years, I have been working with educators and with people in industry to help them understand how do we change the culture and the climate of our environments, whether we're in learning pathways, we're in workforce pathways for people to be successful. My company is called Engineer Inclusion, and I have been on my own as an independent consultant and business for about 2.5 years now, although I've been consulting altogether since 2009. And so I work with companies, I work with organizations, institutions, educational institutions as well, and help them intentionally and systematically and strategically engineer equity and inclusion into their environment so that both the employees are supported and the community is as well. And so that's a little bit about me.
Yes. Yeah. And a perfect example of what I call professional belonging, which is this idea that we also need to feel that sense of belonging where we work and who we work with and how we're valued and so forth. So I'm really excited to get into that. So the first question I always ask my guests is, when I say the word belonging or feeling a sense of belonging, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
When I hear the word belonging, I feel the sense of feeling valued, right? So
Mhm.
it's not only a like, do I belong in this space? But one of the things that I've thought about in my work is like, some people have accused me of being hard-headed, and I can force belonging in a lot of places, but that's very different than feeling like I belong, right?
Sure.
And so when I think about the word belonging, it's it's that feeling that you get when you're in a space, when you feel valued, you feel affirmed in your identity, and you feel welcome and included. So that's what comes to mind when I think about belonging. Not that forced fit, it's that truly invited fit.
Right, right. Brene Brown talks about it. It's not about fitting in and sort of molding yourself the way you think that other people want you to be molded in order to be able to be part of that group, but definitely to be your authentic self and still be affirmed and valued, just like you were saying. So yeah, so that's really important. Um, you you shared in your TED Talk about belonging and why that word is really, or that sense of belonging is so important to you, especially in the field of engineering. And we talk about the lack of women and marginalized, other marginalized in the engineering world. And so can you share that story that you shared in your TED Talk? And I want to tell you that, and tell the listeners that your TED Talk drew me into getting in contact with you, but also I listened to it again today, and it had as much meaning today as it did the first time I watched it. So I will put the link in the show notes. I want people to watch it, but can you sort of share that part of your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I, like many people, start their journey to their career at 18, when we start college. And
Mhm.
I was in a pretty special program, and it was called Women in Engineering. It was funded by Texas Instruments. So the whole goal was to take women who were majoring in math and computer science at the Women's University, pay for their school, give them internships, and then also get a master's in electrical engineering. And
Mhm.
so I was in this program from the beginning. Like, I always knew I was going to be a TIer. And so I have always, still to this day, I still feel like a TIer at heart. And I had many internships at TI. So over the course of my 3 degrees, I've had 4 internships at TI. And when during my master's program, I interned for my thesis, and then I worked full time for that group afterwards.
Okay.
And that was a really hard time of our economy, right? So that was around 2008,
Oh,
2009.
wow. Yes. Yeah.
And and so my first day, like full time, and I'd only been gone like 3 months, because I had like left to finish writing, and then I came back to start. um I actually came back to start early. I wasn't supposed to start until January, but I was so anxious to get started. I said, can I please start in October? So I started in October, and I show up on a Monday, and they had laid off, or they had shut down an entire business group. They hadn't laid anyone off yet. And so like the tone of the space was really heavy
Mm,
that day.
right.
And so one of my colleagues whom I had met during my internship saw me in the hallway, and he says, Meagan, what are you doing here? And I was like, it's my first day. I'm so excited. And he looked at me. He said, you don't deserve to be here.
Oh my
You were
gosh.
only hired because you're a pretty little girl. Now, this has stuck with me. I remember the moment. I know exactly who he is. I remember being in utter shock, because I was thinking, like, what do you mean I don't belong here? Like, I've spent 6 months here. My work has been here. I'm cum laude student. Like, what do you like? I was so in my head, I just couldn't understand what he meant. Like, I don't belong there.
Right.
And I have always been the kind of person that I will force myself to belong in whatever place. Like,
Mhm.
I didn't realize at the time, but I would adapt and assimilate in ways, because to survive, right?
Mhm. Right.
And so when he said that to me, I don't remember if I said anything. I'm pretty sure I didn't, because I wouldn't have had the vocabulary at that time of my life to speak truth to power, because I had
Right.
to work for him, right? Like he
Mhm.
had power over me. And so that was that moment, and it has stuck with me forever, right? And so it just planted this really heavy seed of doubt of like, well, do I not belong here? Because I already had like a sense of like, well, I'm not like everyone else. I'm a woman,
Right.
most everyone else is a man. I remember when I on my like first day also, so this was the beginning, actually probably it was my first day of my co-op with this group, but we all went to lunch, and they're all they were talking about The Office, you know, the TV show The Office.
Oh, yes.
And they were talking about all these pop culture things, and I was lost because I, at that time in my life, I did not watch TV.
Oh.
And I was just like, I really don't fit in because I don't know anything that they're talking about. And they're like, well, what do you do? And I was like, well, I'm working on a documentary right now about a trip to West Africa. And they're just like, I was like, I am an alien to them. And so from that moment, like I started watching The Office. I had never cursed before, but I started cursing, and I'm really good at it now, so don't worry. But I started cursing just to fit in with them, and I like had to watch more football than I ever wanted to. And so it was this whole like I had to take on this act of like I need to fit in with my
Mhm.
teammates. I had to find a way to belong. So fast forward a few years, I had left industry and I had started my doctorate, and I was at an Engineer Without Borders conference. I've been invited to speak there. And I remember also like this visceral feeling similar to my exchange with the guy on my first full day as an engineer. I'm sitting there and I walk in and I'm like, had this great conversation with everyone at the table around me. And then like the lights dim and like the conversation, you know, on the podium gets going, and I'm just enthralled. Like I am so just fueled by everything that the speakers are saying. And then like this feeling like washes over me, and it was foreign. It was really foreign. And I was like, what is this feeling? You know, and I
Wow.
kind of start looking around, and I realize like every person at the table around me is a woman. I look around the room, and there are so like just like a sea of faces of different races and gender identities. And it was all of this beautiful diversity. And I realized in that moment, I was like, I now belong. And
Mhm.
it was the first time in about a 10-year journey of trying to becoming an engineer and being an engineer that I finally felt valued and affirmed. And it was really a pivotal moment for me that I will never forget, because it is my goal to help people find that sense of belonging way sooner in their careers. They shouldn't have to be 10 years in before they have this sense of feeling. And I will note that a colleague of mine watched my TED talk,
Mhm.
and he's an engineer, and he said to me afterwards, he sent in an email. I'm going to read a quote here from him. He said, I worked in a male-dominated engineering industry, oil and gas. We had female engineers. All the way back to the 80s, we had female engineers. I never saw them treated differently, but I never thought about how they might feel in that environment. And to me, when
Interesting.
Tommy told me that and wrote that in the email, like it was such a beautiful aha moment of like, this is the work I'm doing, right? Like I'm helping people. And this guy, he's one of the nicest guys I've ever met. He's probably was wonderful to work with as an
Mhm.
engineer. But so many people like him, when you have that dominant culture, when that dominant identity of a
Sure.
space, you fit in, you belong. And so it's helping people like him, like myself as a white woman, think about the ways in which we can facilitate and enable belongingness for everyone around us, because we
Mhm.
can, right? And so that's really the heart of my work, is helping people have those moments to not only change the environment around them, but change the way our institutions and our systems are established, the policies and procedures, so that we can better facilitate, enable, and structure belongingness for everyone, regardless of their identities.
Right. Yeah. That's so interesting that his perspective and his, he had this insight that he was just doing, he wasn't being intentional. And certainly he wasn't intentionally doing anything he shouldn't be doing, but he wasn't intentionally making sure that everybody felt comfortable at the table. I have an interesting question. I'm not sure if you have an answer for it or not, but you talked about Engineers Without Borders. And for our listeners who don't know what that is, maybe you can just explain a little bit about it. But you said that the atmosphere was different when you were there than in the corporate world of engineering. Do you think it was because of the nature of the organization, Engineering Without Borders, or just it happened to be that group of people got together?
So that's really the only thing I've ever done with Engineers Without Borders, and that was the Engineers Without Borders Canada. And so I think that group may be different than the US based group. I don't know,
Could
but
be, yeah.
I can suspect that kind of organization attracts people who have a desire to make a social difference. So probably everyone's heard of Doctors Without Borders, right? It's the same concept of using engineering design and collaboration to serve populations, where there's, a heightened need. And so I think that particular conference, just the team of organizers, whoever they were, like it attracted a really diverse group of people, right? It wasn't the standard group of, white men that had, that dominate the culture of engineering.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah. And in the corporate world, I know that, again, with STEM and trying to encourage more women to get into engineering and STEM related jobs, is it still as much? I know you're doing this consulting work and it's really important. Is it still as dominated? And yes. And what are the kinds of reactions? So I want to take a step back for I know more about engineer inclusion, but I want you to tell us about engineer inclusion so my listeners understand what that is and what kinds of things you're doing and what reactions you're getting. So it's sort of a step-by-step, take us through, because you're very systematic about it, I think, right?
Yeah. So first of all, women and people of color continue to be persistently underrepresented within engineering and physics and computer science and many technology pathways. When we look around engineering, women in the workforce represent around 14% of engineers. And then when you disaggregate by race, we see that both Black people and Hispanic people are not representative of the number of people within our, US population. And that's true across the globe too. I just don't have all of the global numbers in my head.
Right.
But so people are consistently and persistently underrepresented. There are lots of people who talk about a pipeline metaphor. I'm not a huge fan of that metaphor in the sense of it's problematic in many ways, but we can think about the fact that it does start really early, right? Like we have to have students who are interested in these pathways, and there are so many root causes for understanding the participation and the completion and the persistence of people within these pathways.
Right.
And so even when we think about, some of the, the number of students, female students who graduate from college with engineering degrees is higher than 13%, 14%. In some cases, it's in the low 20s. They still aren't staying in industry. And honestly, I'm part of that statistic, right?
Sure. Yes,
I no longer am in industry. I made a choice to choose a different pathway because of the culture and the climate, right? And that's why people leave. And so what the work that I do is I'm working with educational institutions and I'm working with industry to help them really begin to address some of the issues in culture of climate from both an interpersonal and an institutional level, right?
Okay.
So we need to help equip people with the knowledge and awareness, like my friend Tommy that I mentioned, right? Like we need to help them have that awareness of like what role they can play as a colleague, as a manager, or as a leader. But yet we also need to help them collectively take that skill and create institutional change that begins to better structure organizations to not marginalize people. It's not engineering, but I think about, I was talking with some postdocs that work at UT Southwestern and like their neuroscience research area. And I met them over the weekend, and she said that they get 0 time off for pregnancy. Like they have no maternity leave.
Wow.
And I was like, you're kidding, right? And she's like, no, she's like, I have a PhD, I'm a 4th year postdoc, I can't take maternity leave, and I only make $30,000 a year. And I'm like, well, this creates a really tough place of belonging, right? Do you feel valued? Do you feel affirmed? Not everybody needs money to feel valued and affirmed, but we all need to be able to pay our bills and live our lives.
Sure.
And so those are institutionalized issues that get put into place, right? And again, that's, just a fresh story from someone I met this weekend. Yes. But we can look at the ways in which our leaders are creating structures, the ways in which we have potentially institutionalized racism and sexism and classism into our systems and not even knowing it, right? Mm-hmm. Because the thing about systems is they're created by people and they are upheld by people. And so until we both help people understand the ways in which they can interpersonally begin to make change and then use that same knowledge to again change the system, we won't be able to make the kinds of shifts that we need within our organizations and within those pathways that lead to those careers.
Right. And for the women or those populations that are less represented, to realize that they have the ability or they need to push back, which you didn't realize for the 10 years that you were working. You just kept trying to, be the round peg that fit into the square hole kind of thing. So that's something really interesting also. Do you find when you're doing consulting and when you're having these presenting to the educational institutions or the companies that you have women who also react to it in I didn't realize that I was kind of enabling that behavior?
Yeah, well, I mean, I first want to say, like, the onus should not be on the marginalized to fix the system that oppresses
Thank you
them,
for
right?
pointing that out. Yes, thank you, Meagan.
However, it is often those of us who are from marginalized populations within our fields that do take the lead. And I'm sure that there are many people, participants in my workshops and programs that I hope I'm teaching them something, right? Like I have evidence to suggest that, right? But I can tell you, like, from my experience as a young engineer, I was told one day by a woman who later became a mentor of mine. She was a senior vice president at TI. And she said, Meagan, I want you to go to this women in engineering event. And I was like, no, like, I'm good. Like, I don't need help. I'm fine. Because that's how I saw those groups. And it's very common in industry to have these, employee resource groups.
Right.
And she's like, well, first of all, lesson number 1, you don't say no to a senior vice president. And so I was like, okay, yes, ma'am. So I went to this meeting, and it was really the first time that I had sat down with other women to listen and hear. And this, I remember also this very visceral feeling of like sitting at this huge, enormous boardroom table in a room. The table was too big for the room, and there are all these like big, bulky, like, leather chairs around it. And these women start sharing their stories about how they had been, marginalized and excluded. And I was like, what? Wait, what? Like, that's not supposed to happen. It was like telling me like, hey, water is wet, because it's all I knew. Wow. So I didn't even know all of the ways. Like, I remember thinking like, oh, you mean it's not okay for a guy to call me down to his basement office at 4:50 on a Friday and corner me and then put his hand on my knee and tell me that I need to say, like, I was like, you mean that's not supposed to happen? And because I was young and it was all I knew. And I thought, this is what I have to do to survive in this space. And it was in that moment around that boardroom table that my like rose-colored glasses were just ripped off. And because I had no idea. I mean, I grew up playing, male dominated sports. I grew up in a house full of boys. It was all I knew. Right. And it wasn't until I was surrounded with other women and realized these things. And I imagine that I'm not the only one, right, that experienced that sort of awakening of an awareness of, wow, this is not right. And so just as much as we want to educate people from dominant groups, we also have an opportunity in this work to help people who are being marginalized and excluded and discriminated against and oppressed in ways, recognize the ways in which they are. And then so, yes, I have a client that I'll be working with for the next couple of months. And so I've got a series of workshops, a pair of workshops I'm doing with the leaders. And then I have a pair of workshops I'm doing with all of the women in technology.
Nice.
And so the women in technology, it's not about telling them, hey, you need to fix the system that oppresses you. It's about how do we not continue to hurt one another, right? Like, how do we empower each other? And so that we can collectively lift each other up to make change. Because, if you've heard of the theory, like the queen bee syndrome, like the movie Mean Girls is based on this, is like someone's dissertation actually. But this manifests in industry because there's a sense of scarcity that only so many women can make it to the top. And so many women unintentionally become these queen bees, and then they perpetuate their internalized oppression on other people because they're like, there's not room enough for all of us, so I've got to put you down and harm you. And I think it's Margaret Thatcher quote, which Taylor Swift gets credit for too often, but like, there's a special place in hell for women who don't support women. And I think a lot of people who have internalized the oppression that they felt over time aren't even aware of the ways in which they are perpetuating those messages just as survival tactics. And so we also get an opportunity to help people, have an awareness of that so that we don't unintentionally contribute to those systems and structures that keep putting people down.
Yeah. So many layers to this, to this discussion and to the actual purpose of what you're doing. I read in one of a blog post on engineer inclusion, your website, quote, "I believe, however, that once we learn to recognize inequities and expand our consciousness, we can take action to do something. This pattern is what changes environments and outcomes for everyone." So tell me a little bit more about what you do, the things that you've set up, because I know it's a work in progress for you. And obviously your journey has been really interesting because as you interact and present and work with different groups, you become more aware of those different layers. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, we started talking about belonging, but also that diversity, equity, and inclusion, empowerment for the marginalized groups, but also the awareness on the others. It sounds pretty massive. How do you go about doing that?
One brick at a time. That's my motto for everything, one brick at a time. I think about, Stephen Covey gets credit for the spheres of influence, but it's Greek Stoicism is the origin of those, circles of influence. And I like to read about, and I try to practice the ancient art of Stoicism. But really it's focusing on what can I control? And if I can't control it, then I gotta let it go. And then thinking about, well, where can I influence? And as all of us, as our lives and our careers progress, those circles of what we can control and what we can influence expand and contract over time.
Sure.
And, there are lots of things that the third circle, concentric circle, is the circle of concern. Like, what is it that I care about? But I got to let it go because I can't control it and I can't influence it. A lot of my work is helping people to recognize what is it that you can do within your sphere of influence, within your sphere of control, and let's tackle that and make some progress. So if I'm working with, a 12th grade teacher, physics teacher, they've got one circle of control and influence that may be different than a CEO of a firm, right? And so I'm trying to help people think about what is it that's within their capacity to lead change within those spaces. And so it is very different. And, my goal and what I love to do as a professional is to take all of this amazing research, the scholars have created, and then help it make sense, right? And then help people put it into practice. And so that's really what I get to do as an instructor, as a speaker, as a facilitator, is I take all of the research that I can, distill down into practices that help us as leaders. And all of us are leaders, whether you have power or not, right? And that's something that's really important and foundational to my work and my belief. But thinking about what is it that we can do. Another key piece of my work is helping people to understand and see systems. And this is so important because people who have benefited from the systems often don't see that there is a system, right? When we look at the national conversation in the US right now, there are half dozen or more states who either have or are in the process of legislating language that basically says systemic racism doesn't exist. And it does. And just as systemic sexism exists, systemic classism exists, systemic, like all of the isms exist. But the people who have benefited from the systems don't see that they've benefited because the system works for them, right? And so helping people, and this is particularly useful, I think, in working with engineers, because engineers, they understand systems, like in systems that they're working with. And so I can help them say, like, if you've got a system here, well, why isn't there a system here, in the world that we function? And so helping people, it is also a lens. It's learning to identify and see the systems around us and to see the ways in which we are upholding systems that we may not even realize, the ways in which we are participating and benefiting from systems that we may not even realize, and then building a skill set and a practice to change those systems. And so again, like there's so many layers to the work. I do a lot of keynotes. I like to do that. That's really fun, but I really love teaching people and helping them over an extended period of time. So I like when I get longer engagements with groups so that I can help them learn and then think and then come back and learn again and continue conversation. Because I want to give them a shared vocabulary so that they can continue to talk about and think about the ways in which these things are manifesting on a daily basis, right? Because a one hit isn't going to lead change, but over sustained engagements, they can. I also work with clients using process improvement strategies. So, drawing from like the Six Sigma process improvement models to help them begin to address change systematically. And so those are usually longer term engagements that include professional learning as well as a scaffolded process for beginning to address and increase targeted outcomes. And so I think if I remember your question correctly, it was, what are some of the things that I'm doing? I may have gotten a little off track there.
No, it's wonderful. I'm so fascinated by, like I said, the layers of it and I love the idea of research to practice because we often don't see that. We either see the research, which seems so out of touch with reality, and those practitioners who don't really see that the research applies to them or can't figure out how to use it in a practical sense. So I love that. I know engineer inclusion, you've been consulting for a long time, but engineer inclusion is only a few years old. But I'm wondering how you see the development of when you have that ability to have that ongoing relationship and be able to see them through the different parts of the process. What is that like as you see them go through it? From their point of view, from what kind of reactions do you get from them, and what are you seeing? What are you observing as you go through that with them?
Well, one example I can pull from is a client that I worked with in South Carolina, and it was the South Carolina Technical College system. And I worked with them over the course of about 7 months.
Mhm.
And in this instance, I had the ability to do a pre and a post test so I could measure growth. And so I was trying to understand and measure the growth of the knowledge, the attitudes, and the behaviors, as well as a self-efficacy, which is their belief that they can employ the things that I've been teaching them.
Yes.
And we saw significant growth, not only in their knowledge, many of the attitudes that they had were already what we wanted.
Mhm.
Like they believed the things that we wanted them to believe, but I gave them more knowledge and they changed their behaviors as a result of their experience in this 7-month program. And so those are the kinds of things that I want to see. It's not only about awareness of like, yeah, I believe that people should be equal. Okay, that's great. And do you know a little bit more about that? And do you have some
Mm,
behaviors that you can employ
right.
to make that more of a reality, right? And then how confident do you feel in your ability to employ those skills? And so I love to see data that I get to measure over extensions like that. But with this one particular client, I was chatting with her months after the pre and the post test had been finalized, and she said, you know, you helped a 40-year veteran within their system change their worldview, and they now talk about and think about equity and inclusion within career and technical education pathways. And to me, that's a tremendous win, right? Like
Wow.
I firmly believe that people are good-hearted. Like, I think
Mhm.
that sometimes people can lose focus on the greater good,
Right.
um, that we can become myopic in our worldviews. And
Mm.
sometimes some of those people are participants in my
Mhm.
programs and workshops. And sometimes they have a lot to say. And what I have found is that when you experience some of this like intense cognitive dissonance, that many times the people who are the most vocal and outspoken are the ones who have the biggest growth in the end, you know?
Mhm.
And maybe it sounds hyperbolic, but like I am trying to change hearts and minds, you know? I'm
Yeah.
trying to help people recognize ways that we can not
Yes.
only be kinder, more inclusive humans, but we can see the world around us, so we can begin to see the ways in which other people are experiencing life different than us based on characteristics of their identities that they can't control.
Sure.
And see, well, how do we be a part of a solution to create a more equitable and inclusive world? Um, and so that's really a big part of my work. And the award is seeing people who are changing not only their attitudes and their beliefs, but their behaviors,
Mhm.
and beginning to lead and facilitate change. That's what's most exciting, and
Right.
what
And
I hope to see.
yeah, and you could do it one person at a time. And those you're able to affect, that's wonderful. You know, like you talked about, and especially these days where we feel everything is out of our control, but we do have that ability to control certain things. It's a matter of being aware of what that is and having that effect on those things that we can control. So
Mhm.
I think there's so much there to learn from that what you were just talking about. Um, you, and I'm quoting now, utilize metaphorical projectors and mirrors to shine a light on micro and macro social systems that, when adjusted, improve student, employee, and organizational success. And I know when you're talking students, or I think when you're talking students, you're talking about students who are older, who are already in that engineering program. But I'm wondering how that, I mean, you were a student K to 12 also. If there's any kind of advice or insights that you could give as a result of what you're doing at the corporate and maybe higher education level for K-12 teachers or even for middle school, high school teachers in the
I
STEM
do.
field. Yeah.
I work with lots of K-12 teachers.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's actually the lion's share of the work I've done the last decade is with K-12. And my dissertation research was focused on the experiences of girls in high school
Oh,
engineering.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so I used as in my introduction, I talked about I worked on these tiny mirrors. And
Mhm.
so much of this work and equity and inclusion work is about helping people to see a mirror, right?
Yes.
And to see themselves, not only to see their reflection of how their identity affects how they move through the world, but to see themselves in relation to the experiences of other people. And so, I use the mirror as a metaphor to think about, we need to learn to look in, we need to learn to look bigger and broader to see out. And then when we begin to adjust those lenses, when we begin to adjust the ways in which we work, we can change the outcomes for students, right?
Right.
So one of the programs I'm working on is through the National Science Foundation. It's a funded program, and we're starting year 4 of that. And so we just had one of our team meetings right before you and I talked, Eileen.
Nice.
And we have come up with a really beautiful, we're so excited, we're all so thrilled because we just had this brainstorming session to decide what are we going to do for our 4th year, because it's
Mhm.
going to be different than the past 3 years. And we're thinking about how are we bringing in educators who have been through our engineering and equity training. So we've had 3 cohorts. They've been through those year-long programs. They've done action research to employ equity practices within their science and engineering programs.
Mhm.
And they've learned some electrical engineering concepts and lessons.
Wow.
And so we're talking about how are we going to pull them back for this 4th year and empower them to truly employ and activate and practice the things that they've learned over the course
Mhm.
of their time through this program.
Yes.
Because teachers, I love teachers because I think that they sacrifice so much of their life and their health and their
Mhm.
well-being to serve students. They do not get paid enough. They do not get enough respect,
Yeah.
and lots of other things. And so many of them care so passionately about serving students and improving
Mhm.
outcomes.
Mhm.
And what we get to do through my work, that I work with other organizations to as well, is to empower them with the tools and the skills to
Yes.
see what's within my circle of influence, what's within my control, and how
Mhm.
do I begin to lead the change within that. And so we're again just helping them to see what part we play in the system and how do we begin to make some change.
Yeah. That must be so exciting to see that the way that they feel empowered by being able to put what they learned into practice. So I can see why you're also excited about the 4th year, if that's, where you're headed, and to know that you've had that length of time with them. So that sounds so awesome. Meagan, this has been fantastic. I have had no idea. I mean, I left a bunch of my questions because there were so many other things that I was fascinated and interested in pursuing with what you were saying. So, but I just want to ask you before we finish up, is there anything that you wanted to talk about or anything that I didn't ask you?
Well, I just want to welcome and encourage everyone to visit my website, engineerinclusion.com, sign up for my newsletter. Every email, I 100% commit to send something that adds value to you and to your journey.
Mhm.
I wish I sent something more often than I did, but I'm good to get something out once a month, I think. But if you want to learn about all of the resources, because one of the things that's really important to me is that I share basically everything that I create. And so everything that I develop, I put out on my website for people to use. If you need help in using those, you can ask me for help as a service provider. But really, I think I'm just trying to create tools for people who are empowered to want to lead some change within their circles of influence. And so I hope that you check out my website, because I've got tons of great tools and resources that you can use within your work. And even though we've much of our conversation has been focused on engineering, really it's good for any team.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And so while I've worked mostly within STEM and career and technical education pathways, it's really useful for everyone. And so and I try to write things that are accessible to all populations. And so please check that out. Join my mailing list. And if you want to check out the TED Talk, you can go to engineeringinclusion.com/ILD, which is inclusive leadership development. So engineeringinclusion.com/ILD, and then you can watch the TED Talk. I created a discussion guide, so to help people who, like, if you want to have, a team meeting and your coworkers, you all watch it. It's 11 minutes. And then I've got several page discussion guide to give you some questions to facilitate some conversation around the shared language that hopefully that you're able to create in that time. I encourage you to do that. And I just, I want to offer encouragement. I think many of your listeners, Eileen, are educators, right?
Right.
And just, encourage them, to those of you who are listening to this, that, the work that you do is so important, and that you have such a tremendous opportunity to lead and transform change. And I want to send all good vibes and support to you, because the times that we're facing right now, educators, my clients and participants across the country, they're all burnt out and they're stressed and they're not getting what they need from their administration. And I just want you to know that I see you and we need you, and please keep supporting our students for as long as you can. And my fear is that we see a great resignation of educate. My brother has left education because of
it's unfortunate. Yeah, it really is. And your words are so heartfelt and sincere, but because you're within that space and you understand the importance of that, but you also see that there is a path for them to be able to feel empowered, which many of them who are resigning right now or feeling burnt out don't feel they have that power at all to voice. And I've seen it, on social media, and I'm sure you have. I can also vouch for the fact that over the couple of months since I had looked at your website, a lot has increased in terms of different kinds of resources. And I love the website. There's so much there, really. So I would second the motion and vouch for the fact that, yes, people will really find a lot to take away from the website, and to sign up for your newsletter also. Where else, if they want to look for you, where else can they find you, Meagan?
I'm most active on LinkedIn, so you can follow, connect with me, follow me. I have an engineer inclusion page as well. I like to pretend that I'm active on the other pages, but I haven't figured out how to have time for all of those things.
There's so many hours in a day. Yes.
And so, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to learn more about the work that others are doing, and I'd love to learn from other people as well. And so connect with me there. On my website, I keep on the homepage, where I'm going to be teaching and presenting. And so again, if you're on my mailing list, you'll hear about opportunities that are open for anybody to come listen and learn. If you're interested. I also have on my website a network. And so
I was wondering about that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's called the Engineer Inclusion Network. It's a space that I have curated to build community with people who are wanting to find connection with others who care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I also use it to to create courses. So I share some content on that network as well.
Nice.
But I'm working hard to kind of generate more community conversations. And so it's outside of Facebook. So it's safe from that network.
Mhm.
And it is basically a private social network.
Nice.
But it's open and it's free. And so I encourage anybody to join us there and just find community. I do like monthly networking events and post discussion prompts and things like that. And so that's another way that you can plug in and connect with the work that I'm doing. So
Awesome. I'll be sure to sign up as soon as we get off here.
great. Thanks, Eileen.
Thank you, Meagan. This was absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much from you. I had learned already just from watching your TED Talk and looking at your website and the chat that we had a couple of months ago, but really deeply grateful for, and I think it's so timely. I think people need to hear this. And so I'm looking forward to putting it out there in a bit. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you and to connect and for elevating my work. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.